Hello students, in this video we are going to talk about degrees of freedom. Consider a motion of particle moving freely in space. Then the motion of this particle can be expressed or can be described using three independent coordinates such as Cartesian coordinate system, polar coordinate system or cylindrical coordinate system. In Cartesian coordinate system, we can use to describe motion along x, y, z axis. Spherical polar coordinates, we can use coordinates as r, theta and phi. For cylindrical coordinates system, if we are going to use an cylindrical coordinate system, then we can use coordinates such as r, theta and z. And any one of these three independent coordinates we can use to describe the motion of particle. Now suppose particle is performing motion along any one axis independently with change in one coordinate only, then we can say that particle is moving freely in space, has 3 degrees of freedom. So we can define these degrees of freedom as the number of independent ways, in which system of particles can move, without disturbing constraints. In last video we have seen constraint. Constraint means restrictions on motion of system of particles. Okay. Now for example, to understand these degrees of freedom, we can take an example of a particle is constrained to move in xy plane. Consider a particle constrained to move in xy plane, so that we can define the motion, we can describe the motion of particle using only two variables, either x and y. So that here degrees of freedom are here 2 degrees of freedom. Particle is said to have 2 degrees of freedom. If we are going to say n particles moving independently in a three-dimensional in a space, then degrees of freedom for n particles moving in space, we can write 3n. Now take another example. Consider a rigid rod of length L. Now one end of this rigid particle at one end of this rigid rod is fixed, and particle at another end of this rigid rod is rotating in a plane with a radius equal to the length of this rigid rod. Then the motion of this particle can be defined by only one variable called as theta, so that this particle having 1 degrees of freedom. From this, in general, we can say that constraints are introduced into system, then number of degrees of freedom is reduced.